Have you ever wondered what you'd do if your car fell into a frozen river? Yeah, what was supposed to be a simple Sunday drive nearly became the end of the road for Paul. But what nobody could have imagined is that what saved his life was a long-forgotten video he'd watched years ago. And today, I'm going to tell you this unbelievable survival story. Before we go on, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell, because here you'll hear the most mind-blowing stories of people who survived the impossible. And tell me in the comments, have you ever heard a story where someone escaped death because they remembered something at the last second? Let's begin. Paul Cooper had always been that average guy, 32 years old, worked as an IT technician, and lived a quiet life in the peaceful town of Pinewood, tucked away in the frozen heart of Minnesota. He loved driving, felt like the open road helped him sort out his thoughts. But that Sunday, the road decided to rewrite his story. The sky was gray, and the sun hadn't shown its face all day. One of those bitter January mornings when the wind feels like razor blades against your skin. Paul had left early to visit his parents, who lived on the other side of town. The road he always took was lined with snow-covered pine trees, and just up ahead, the infamous Cedar River, frozen over but dangerously deceptive. That morning seemed just like any other, until Paul hit a curve he'd taken 100 times before. But this time, too late, he realized the road was coated in a thin sheet of black ice, invisible to the eye, deadly to any driver who let their guard down. The car skidded. It was fast, silent, like the world had switched to slow motion. The steering wheel spun out of his hands, and all Paul could do was let out a muffled scream as the car smashed through the guardrail. The sound of metal crashing through the ice was deafening. The car plunged straight into the frozen river. On impact, the ice shattered like glass, and the car began to sink, slowly, sucked down by the dark, freezing waters of the Cedar. Inside, Paul panicked. The thermal shock was brutal. Freezing water seeped in through the cracks, and the icy air sliced at every inch of exposed skin. Panic took over. He tried to open the door. Locked. He reached for the seatbelt. Stuck. The sound of rushing water filling the cabin was deafening. For a moment, he thought that was it. But then, in that tiny sliver of time between panic and death, something incredible happened. A memory from some random video he'd watched on YouTube years ago exploded in his mind. One of those videos you see and think, hey, I'll never need that. It showed how to escape a sinking car, and that memory, that tiny spark of hope, began to shift Paul's fate. The sound of metal creaking and ice cracking still echoed in Paul's ears, like the world had gone silent, just so he could hear death approaching. The freezing water surged upward, climbing over the passenger seat, licking at his legs, burning like 1,000 needles stabbing into his skin. It wasn't the cold of the snow or the wind. This was something else. This was the cold of death wrapping around him. The car sank slowly, almost cruelly. Bubbles rose lazily past the windows, and Paul's chest tightened with a mix of terror and disbelief. This can't be real. This isn't happening. It can't end like this, but it was happening. And if he didn't act, it would end right there in that metal and glass tomb. The car's interior, once so familiar, now felt like a nightmare. The steering wheel slipped in his wet hands, the dashboard flickered, and the electronics were failing. The radio still played some random country song. Ironic, he thought. He was about to die, and his final soundtrack was a song he didn't even like. The smell of wet leather, rust, and river water filled the space. The windows fogged up fast, and the darkness outside looked like it was ready to swallow him whole. It felt like the car was sinking straight into a frozen hell. That's when his survival instinct finally screamed out. Paul remembered, like a spark, something from that video he saw years ago. He remembered the guy saying that the biggest mistake people make is trying to open the door right away. It's impossible. The pressure from the water outside will always win. You have to wait. But how do you wait when the water is already up to your chest? Panic slammed into him again. Paul tried once more to unbuckle the seatbelt, yanking hard, jerking his body around, The latch wouldn't budge. Fear gripped his throat. Hot tears rolled down his cheeks, a shocking contrast to the freezing cold surrounding him. He thought of his parents, his mom waiting for lunch, thought he'd never see them again. And then another piece of the video came to him. The glass breaker. Glass breaker, but I don't have that stupid thing, Paul yelled, pounding the steering wheel. But then he remembered what else the video said. If you don't have one, use your headrest. The metal rods can break the side window. Paul felt his heart beat hard for the first time since the crash. It was a chance. A small one. Almost ridiculous, but still a chance. The water was up to his chest now, and the cold was stealing his strength. But he stretched his arm with everything he had and yanked the headrest from the seat. The metal was slippery, but he managed to yank it free. His hands were trembling so badly, he nearly dropped it. With what little strength he had left, he twisted his body and aimed at the side window. He struck. The first attempt was pathetic. The metal slipped and hit the seat. "Damn it! Go!" he shouted. He took a deep breath, bit his lip until he tasted blood, and hit again, this time with all the rage, fear, and desperation built up inside him. The glass cracked, a tiny miracle, but not enough. Paul knew he couldn't stop now. Either he broke that window, or he'd be just another frozen body swept away by the cedar's current. The muffled sound of the glass cracking felt like a small victory, but Paul knew he was far from getting out. The freezing water now covered almost his entire body, and every move drained what little strength he had left. The cold was so intense, his fingers started to go numb, and his whole body trembled uncontrollably. He stared at the cracked window like it was his last hope, took a deep breath, chest aching, and braced himself for another try. He raised the headrest again, and using every ounce of energy he had, struck exactly where the glass had already weakened. This time the sound was sharper. A clean snap, like the whole car had cracked along with the glass. A small piece of the window gave way, and the river didn't hesitate. A blast of icy water surged in even faster, ripping a scream from Paul. "Come on, for God's sake, just one more," he muttered through clenched teeth, his jaw locked from the cold. He knew he didn't have much time. The car was nearly completely underwater now, and the light outside was fading fast, like the world was forgetting he existed. The sound of ice cracking outside didn't stop, as if the river itself wanted to pull him under. He could feel the car groaning, the creaks of the frame caving under the weight of water and ice. Every passing second, everything around him looked more and more like a nightmare he wouldn't wake up from. But the memory of the video came back with every heartbeat. Aim for the corner of the window. It's the weakest spot. Paul adjusted his angle, took one more breath, if you could even call it that, and slammed the headrest again with everything he had. The metal rod finally pierced through, shattering the glass and opening a hole about the size of a soccer ball. It was now or never. He knew what he had to do, but panic froze him for a moment. What if the hole was too small? What if he got stuck? What if he didn't make it? His mind screamed with doubt, but somewhere deep inside, a calm voice, almost like the one from that old video, whispered, "Go, now." Without thinking, he pulled himself back and shoved his head through the hole first. The pain was instant. His soaked jacket caught on the jagged glass, tearing the skin on his arm and shoulder. Blood streamed out, mixing with the filthy, freezing water. But Paul didn't even feel it. Adrenaline was the only thing keeping him moving. Air. He was running out. His lungs burned, his heart pounded erratically, ready to burst. He pushed harder, ignoring the pain, ignoring the fear, and finally managed to get half his body through the opening. That's when the car dipped again, and the hole began to close around him. He was stuck. For a second, that felt like an eternity. His chest was crushed between glass and metal. With one final push, he forced his hips through, tearing his jacket even more, and felt his body slip through the broken window. And then, he was out. For the first time since the crash, Paul felt his face break through the surface. He sucked in air so hard, his chest screamed in pain. The sky, gray and distant, was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. But the Cedar River wasn't done with him yet. That first breath felt like swallowing knives. Paul's chest burned, and the cold above water was no less cruel than what he'd just escaped. His face stung, his eyes watered uncontrollably, and for a second he thought he'd gone blind. But no, it was the sky, that cloudy gray sky blurring into his watery vision. But the relief didn't last. When he tried to pull himself up, the cedar's current revealed its true strength. It was like the river had woken up, furious, determined not to let him go. The water spun his body like a rag doll, pulling him toward the chunks of broken ice. Paul slammed into a drifting sheet of ice, the impact sharp enough to cut his forehead. Warm blood ran down his face, lost in the freezing water. Every second out there was torture, the cold seeping into his bones, his muscles starting to lock up. No, I can't stop now, he thought, fighting the current, trying to recall everything he knew about hypothermia. He knew his body would soon stop responding. He knew if he didn't get out of the water soon, he'd be dead within minutes. Desperately, he scanned the landscape for a shore, a branch, anything he could grab onto. But the scene around him was merciless. The river was a corridor of ice and death, surrounded by snow-covered trees and slippery, steep banks. The sound of ice breaking and water thrashing filled everything. There was no one around, no cars on the road, no cries for help, just him and that white and gray world determined to erase him from existence. And then, spinning helplessly in the current, Paul saw it. A large tree trunk, stuck at the riverbank, half submerged, covered in ice, but still there, unmoving. That was his only chance. With what little strength he had left, he started swimming toward it. Every stroke was agony, his body heavy, his muscles refusing to obey. The freezing water bit into his skin, and the exhaustion felt like a monster pulling him down. Just a little more, please God, he repeated like a mantra. His right arm finally reached the trunk. His frozen fingers could barely grip, but he clung to it with everything he had. The wood was slick, slippery, covered in ice. He tried to pull himself up, slipped, tried again. This time, he dug his nails into whatever he could and felt his skin tear. It didn't matter. Pain was better than dying out there. With a hoarse groan, he managed to hoist himself halfway onto the trunk. His chest heaved, breath coming in heavy clouds, and Paul looked around. The car was no longer visible, swept away by the river. Only the shattered ice and the violent current remained to witness what had just happened. He was alive, for now, but he still had to get out of there. The closest shoreline looked like it was miles away, and the snow had started falling harder. The cold was no longer pain. It was numbness. Hypothermia was setting in. Paul realized in that moment that escaping the car had only been the beginning of his fight to survive. Now, he had to escape the river, and fast. Paul clung to the trunk like his life depended on it, because it did. Every second he stayed there felt like it was draining what little strength remained in his body. The cold was no longer just a feeling. It was a presence, a shadow wrapping around him, numbing his hands, his feet, even his thoughts. For a moment, he felt the urge to give in, to close his eyes, let his body slip off the trunk, and disappear into the dark water. He was so exhausted, even breathing hurt. No one's gonna find me here. No one will even know what happened, he thought, feeling tears mix with the blood on his forehead and the ice forming on his face. But then, like God blew one last breath into his lungs, the image of his parents came rushing back, his mom cooking Sunday lunch, his dad always waiting on the porch. I can't die here. I won't make them bury an empty coffin. With that last flicker of clarity, Paul scanned his surroundings. The bank still looked far, but there was a path, a line of half-submerged rocks and branches that maybe, just maybe, could lead him there. He knew his body wouldn't hold out much longer, but he had no choice. If he stayed, death would come anyway. He had to move. He had to try. He took a deep breath, feeling the air slice through his lungs, and slid off the trunk back into the water. The shock was even worse than the first time. His skin felt like it was splitting open, like his body couldn't take any more abuse. But he pushed forward, stroke by stroke, with heavy, sluggish movements. a nearly superhuman effort. The current tried to drag him back, spin him, slam him into chunks of ice, but Paul kept his eyes on the rocks ahead, like a wounded animal chasing shelter. Time didn't exist anymore. Every meter gained was a victory, every bit of progress a miracle. And when he finally felt his fingers graze one of the larger stones, he grabbed on with everything he had. His body was slipping, his soaked clothes weighed a ton. The urge to just let go and let the river win came again and again. But Paul held on. With the last thread of strength, he began dragging himself from rock to rock until he finally felt earth under his fingers. Cold mud, mixed with snow, but solid ground. He had reached the bank. He could barely believe it. He cried. He laughed. But there was no time to celebrate. That's when he heard the crack, a sharp sound coming from the trees. The ground beneath him shifted slightly, like the bank was about to give way. He looked to the side and saw the earth splitting, sinking. His weight and the melting ice had weakened the edge. "No, not now," he whispered, desperate. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't move. Tried to crawl, but the ground was slipping out from under him. It was like being on the edge of a cliff with death yanking at his ankle for one last time. And then he saw it. A thick root jutting out of the earth a few feet away. It was his last hope. With a guttural scream, Paul lunged forward, body heavy, vision blurred, and grabbed the root with both hands. The earth behind him gave out, a whole section of the bank collapsing into the river. But he was still there, hanging on, alive. The silence that followed was almost deafening. Only the sound of his own ragged breathing, and the river carrying away the piece of land where he had nearly died. Now, Paul was out of the water, but the cold was still the enemy. Hypothermia had already sunk its claws into him, and if he didn't warm up soon, the river wouldn't have to do anything else. Paul clung to that thick root like a castaway adrift at sea, breathing with difficulty, his body trembling uncontrollably. The ground gave way beneath his feet. The river claimed what was left of the riverbank. And by some miracle, he was still there. Alive, but the victory felt hollow. His body no longer responded. His fingers could barely hold onto the root, and he knew. At any moment, he could slip and go straight under. He summoned what strength remained and began to pull himself up, feeling his skin tear on the rough bark and cold mud seep into the open wounds. Every movement was agony, but slowly, inch by inch, he managed to drag his body far enough to roll away from the edge of the bank. Lying face down in the snow, gasping for breath, Paul closed his eyes for a moment, but his body no longer felt the cold of the snow, and that was the worst sign. He knew hypothermia was already advancing. When the cold begins to fade, it doesn't mean your body is winning. It means it's losing. Get up, damn it," he whispered to himself. But his legs wouldn't respond. It was as if they no longer belonged to him. Tears of rage and fear spilled down his face. He couldn't die here, not after everything he'd fought through. Then he remembered. The phone. He didn't know if it was still in his pocket or if the water had already destroyed any chance of calling for help, but he had to try. With trembling hands, he searched through his shredded coat. Even finding the pocket was a challenge. He slid his fingers in and there it was, the phone. Heavy, soaked, but there. He pulled it out and tried to turn on the screen. Nothing. Pressed the button again. Once, twice, 3 times. Nothing. Panic began to rise like a monster inside him. No, please, no. Then, a flicker of hope. The screen lit up for a second, flashing like the final flame of a dying candle. He saw the signal bars, weak, barely there, but it was enough for one last attempt. With fingers stiff as stones, he opened his contacts and tapped his dad's name. The phone rang, once, twice, but dropped. He tried again. This time he called emergency services. The phone buzzed faintly, battery nearly dead. He pressed the button so hard he felt his fingertips split open. When the call finally connected, Paul barely had the strength to speak. "Help, fell in the river. I'm freezing to death." The words came out disjointed, his voice shaking even more than his body. On the other end, The dispatcher tried to understand him, asked for his location, told him to speak louder, but Paul could barely hold the phone. Every second felt like a superhuman effort. That's when he looked to the side and saw a deer. A massive deer, standing at the edge of the forest, staring right at him. For a second, Paul thought he was hallucinating, but the animal was real, calm, looking at him as if it understood exactly what was happening. Paul gave a faint smile, feeling the world spin around him. The dispatcher's voice faded. The cold turned into warmth, a strange warmth, the clear sign that his body was shutting down. In his mind, only one thought echoed: if they don't find me soon, it's over. And there, lying in the snow, with a deer as his only witness, Paul felt the world begin to go dark, but he was still breathing. And as long as he breathed, there was still hope. The world around Paul began to fade, the white of the snow, the gray of the sky. It all blended together into a blur. The pain in his limbs was gone, and that, instead of relief, brought a desperate kind of fear. He knew what that meant. He was freezing, for real. The call to rescue? He didn't even know if it had gone through. The memory of the dispatcher asking for his location blurred into the image of that deer, still there, watching him, like a silent sentinel. The animal didn't move, just observed, as if it knew Paul's time was running out. And it was. The deadly cold had passed the skin, entered the bones, and was now taking the heart, the brain. Paul caught himself smiling for no reason, feeling a strange warmth. It was the classic sign of severe hypothermia, when the body, seconds from shutting down, gives the illusion of being warm. Is this how it ends? He thought, closing his eyes for a moment. But then, a miracle. The sound of an engine sliced through the silence of the forest, far away, very far, but real. The sound of a car or a truck. He couldn't tell. He wanted to scream, but no voice came out. He tried to move, raise his arm, but his body no longer responded. It felt like he was trapped inside his own skin, fully aware, but helpless. The engine grew louder. And then the silence returned. For a moment, Paul thought he'd imagined it all. But then a new voice echoed through the forest. Is anyone out here? The sound came from the road. Police? Paramedics? It didn't matter. They were here. He tried to respond. Nothing. Not even a groan. It was the deer, ironically the one who seemed to understand the situation, that made the first move. The animal stirred, made a loud noise, turned abruptly, and darted into the forest, drawing attention to Paul's location. The crunch of heavy boots on the snow followed right after. "Oh my God! I found him!" a man shouted. Paul felt someone touch him. Warm hands, or at least less cold than his, rolled him gently to the side, checking for a pulse. "He's alive. Quick, get the thermal blanket." Everything happened fast, but to Paul it felt like a dream. He felt the blanket thrown over his body, someone tugging at his soaked clothes, another voice talking about calling an ambulance and starting warming protocol. But then came a new obstacle. The ambulance wouldn't be able to reach that spot easily. The Cedar River, cold and treacherous, cut across the road. The broken ice, tree limbs, and piled-up snow blocked the path. "If we don't get him out now, he's not going to make it," one of the rescuers said, his voice low and tense. Paul heard it like a verdict. Being found wasn't enough. Now they had to get him out of there, fast. The rescuers improvised. They tied ropes together, built a makeshift stretcher from branches and the thermal blanket, and began dragging him through the forest toward a spot where a helicopter could land. Every bump was torture. Paul felt his body giving up, his vision darkening. But even though he couldn't speak, his mind kept repeating, "I'm alive. Don't leave me. I'm alive." The helicopter, still far away, and time was running out. The sky stayed heavy and gray as the rescuers pulled Paul through a narrow trail carved through the forest. Thick snow blanketed everything, making every step, every pull of the makeshift stretcher harder. Sweat dripped down their faces despite the biting cold, because they knew they weren't just hauling a man. They were trying to save what little life he had left. His body was stiff, pale as the snow itself. His skin had started to show purple blotches, and his lips had lost all color. Hypothermia was advancing fast, and with each passing minute, another sentence was being written. "He's slipping," one of the rescuers murmured, checking Paul's faint pulse. The team leader, a seasoned man named Michael, didn't hesitate. He raised the radio and called the helicopter, his voice rough with tension. "Dispatch, this is the rescue team. Survivor located, but he's in critical condition. Severe hypothermia. I need that aircraft at the extraction point now." The reply came, but it wasn't what he wanted to hear. "Copy that, Michael. Visibility's bad. The chopper's still about 10 minutes out." 10 minutes. It might not sound like much, but out there, in the middle of that frozen forest, it was way too long. Michael looked at the rest of the team. Waiting wasn't an option. If they didn't act fast, Paul would die right there in their hands. "We need to warm him up. Now!" One of the rescuers took off his own jacket, ignoring the cold, and covered Paul. Another began rubbing his arms, trying to get the blood flowing again. Someone pulled out a lighter, trying to spark a small fire with dry twigs and leaves, even knowing it wouldn't be enough. Paul felt it all like a distant dream. The hands of the rescuers seemed miles away, just like their voices, muffled by the wind. He heard them, but couldn't process what they were saying. Suddenly, flashes of life began flooding his mind. Childhood memories, his father teaching him to fish in the same Cedar River that had nearly claimed him. His mom smiling on the porch, his first car, his first love. It was like his brain was already saying goodbye. Michael noticed. He knelt beside Paul, grabbed his face firmly, and spoke up close, almost shouting, "Hey man, listen to me. Stay with us. Don't fall asleep. You fought too hard to die now, you hear me?" Paul wanted to respond. He wanted to say he was trying, but no sound came out. The sound of the helicopter blades in the distance was the most beautiful thing they'd ever heard. It appeared on the horizon, cutting through the low clouds, fighting the wind and snow. "It's coming. Hang in there, man. Just a little longer," one of the rescuers shouted. The pilot knew it was a risky mission. The terrain wasn't ideal, but he brought the helicopter in as close as he could, dropping the rope ladder while the ground team got into position. Wasting no time, the rescuers strapped Paul onto the improvised stretcher and began hoisting him up. Every meter felt like a release, and at the same time, a gamble. The wind shook everything, snow blinded them, but finally, Paul was being lifted out of that frozen hell. Inside the helicopter, the medical team's hands moved fast. They checked his vitals, wrapped him in thermal blankets, and started the gradual rewarming process. Paul was in their hands now, between life and death. Michael looked up, took a deep breath, and whispered with relief, "Now, it's up to you, warrior." But the battle wasn't over. Paul was alive. But the line between life and death had never been thinner. The deafening roar of the blades was the last thing Paul heard before everything went black. By the time the helicopter landed on the hospital's helipad, he was unresponsive, motionless, pale. His skin was mottled with purple and blue. His heartbeat, faint, was nearly gone. The ER team rushed out, already briefed on the critical state of the man who had defied death in a frozen river. The emergency protocol kicked in. Every second counted. If hypothermia had already won, there'd be nothing more they could do. "We've got a severe hypothermia case. Get the external heater, prep warm IV fluids, and start monitoring the heart now," the lead doctor shouted, her voice steady, though her eyes betrayed the gravity of the situation. Paul was placed on a gurney and rushed straight into the trauma bay. His clothes were cut away with surgical scissors, every soaked layer revealing more of his stiff blue skin. The doctors exchanged silent glances. They all knew what this meant. Paul's body temperature was so low, the monitor could barely read it. His body had already started shutting down. The emergency procedures began. Bags of warmed saline were connected directly to his veins. Thermal blankets wrapped him completely, and warm air was blown gently across his body. But the biggest fear was his heart. Extreme hypothermia causes fatal arrhythmias. Any sudden movement, any abrupt change, and Paul's heart could stop. As the team worked, the minutes dragged on like an eternity. Outside, Paul's parents had arrived, brought by the same emergency responders who'd answered the call. His mother, seeing her son in that condition, broke down. A nurse had to hold her up. "Oh my God! Is he going to make it?" she asked, voice shaking. The doctor looked at her, face serious. "We're doing everything we can. But it's critical. He went too far. Now it's up to him." Inside the room, the monitor beeped faintly, tracking Paul's heart as it struggled to keep beating. One of the doctors leaned toward the lead physician and whispered, "If there's no response in the next 15 minutes, there's nothing more we can do." Silence swept over the room. Then, like a thread of hope, the heart monitor showed a slight increase in rhythm. Weak, but it was there. Paul's heart was trying. The doctor closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and ordered, "Keep going. He's fighting. We fight with him." Hour after hour, Paul's body was slowly warmed. The bluish hue began to fade from his face, and his once stiff fingers started to twitch, small but undeniable signs of life. Outside, Paul's parents prayed. His mother, on her knees on the cold hospital floor, begged God not to take her son. His father, a man of few words, just stared at the emergency room doors, waiting, hoping. And then, just as everyone was preparing for the worst, the doctor came out. He's not out of the woods yet. But his heart responded. He's alive. His mother's sobs echoed down the hallway. His father, eyes glassy, allowed himself to smile. For the first time, Paul, against all odds, was still here. But the fight wasn't over yet. Now, it was time to see if his body could handle the aftermath of hypothermia. It was days balanced between life and death. Paul remained unconscious, trapped between the world of the living and the abyss where hypothermia had nearly dragged him. Every hour in the hospital was a silent battle. Doctors monitored every heartbeat, every breath, while his family took turns at his bedside, hoping for a miracle. And it came, quietly, but it came. On the third day, just when everyone had begun to fear the worst, Paul's eyes opened. First, just a faint flicker of his eyelids, then a lost gaze, like he didn't recognize his own body or where he was. But little by little, awareness returned. The first thing he saw was his mother's face, eyes swollen, smile trembling, and her hand holding his like she'd never let go again. "You came back, my son. Oh God, you came back," she whispered, tears falling freely. Paul tried to speak, but his dry throat only allowed for a hoarse whisper. "I thought I wouldn't make it." The doctor approached, her expression tired but satisfied. "You gave us quite a scare, Paul. Not many people come back from something like that." That's when he realized he was alive. Against all odds, against the cold, the ice, even his own failing body, he had made it. But recovery would be slow. His body still bore the marks of the fight: frostbite, abrasions, scars. The following weeks were filled with physical therapy, medications, and long conversations with psychologists trying to understand how someone survives something so extreme. Paul didn't talk much, but he always repeated the same thing. "I only made it because I remembered that video. That video saved my life." And it was true. A forgotten bit of knowledge, some random video he'd watched years ago, had been the thread of hope that pulled him back. The accident made headlines in his town, and soon, across the country. People were moved by the story of the man who defied death in a frozen river and survived because of a memory. Paul, however, avoided the spotlight. He preferred the silence of his parents' porch, staring at the sky, grateful for one more day. The experience changed everything in him. The way he saw life, the little things, the smell of coffee in the morning, the warmth of the sun on his face, the sound of birds outside the window. He decided to do something with that second chance. He recorded a video, the first one in his life, telling his story, warning others what to do in a situation like his. "If this video saves even one life, everything I went through will have been worth it," he said, looking straight into the camera. The video went viral. Thousands watched, commented, and shared. And most importantly, they learned. Paul became, unintentionally, a symbol of resilience. But to him, the greatest reward was simple: waking up every day and feeling his heart pounding strong in his chest, knowing he survived, and now had the chance to truly live. Life was never the same again, not because he almost died, but because now he understood the value of being alive. And whenever someone asked him how he made it, Paul would smile slightly and say, "Because I believed, because I fought, and because, deep down, I knew it wasn't my time yet."